Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Distinguished Lecture for 2008. One of the very pleasant experiences I have as Dean of the Faculty is that every fall term I visit somewhere between 40 and 50 first-year seminars that this faculty sponsors and try to pass on a few words of wisdom to our incoming first-year students. And one of the messages I give them is that a great deal of the richness of life at a university, any university, but certainly Carleton University, takes place outside classrooms. And they usually find this a rather odd thought until I explain it to them. But I think it is indeed true, and we're very blessed in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences to have a very rich program of speakers, lectures, conferences, colloquia, symposia, performances, debates, panels, and so on. And there's usually half a dozen of such things going on any night of the week during the term. But each year we have one very special event, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Distinguished Lecture, now in its 8th year. And I'm very honored that a number of my predecessors as Dean are in the audience tonight, including one, who was very much responsible for the early years of this series. Over those 8 years, we've had some remarkable speakers. The first one, Mark Starowitz, recently received an honorary degree from Carleton at our fall convocation. He was our first distinguished lecturer in 2001. We've had Michael Ignatieff before he was involved in politics in Canada. We've had Stephen Lewis, and last year a very memorable lecture from Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who in our view should have won the Nobel Peace Prize, but didn't. This year, to add to that series of distinguished individuals, I'm very pleased to welcome our new Carleton University President, Dr. Roseann Runte. Dr. Runte has had a very remarkable career. She is a poet, she is a scholar, she is an educator, and also a university administrator. Perhaps more interestingly for us in FASS, she is a passionate supporter of the arts, of literature, of language education, of bilingualism, and also of human rights. Her career began, at least the Canadian part of it began some decades ago when she came to Nova Scotia, where she taught in the Department of French at Dalhousie University from 1972 to 1983. She was chair of the department at Dalhousie. She then went on to university presidency, the Université Sainte-Anne in Nova Scotia, where she was president for 5 years from 1983 to 1988. She then came to Ontario, where she was principal of Glendon College at York University from 1988 to 1994. She stayed in Toronto, but moved to be president of Victoria University and the University of Toronto from 1994 to 2001, and then went to Old Dominion University in Virginia, where she was president from 2001 to 2008. So if we count being principal of Glendon as really a form of presidency, Carleton is her 5th university presidency. Of course, we were very pleased to welcome her here on the 1st of July of this year. I had a remarkable day just about exactly a year ago when someone who was conducting the search for the presidency of Carleton asked to see me and came into my office and said, "I have something to talk to you about, but before I can do that, you have to sign all these papers." So I had to sign, my life away, that I would be damned in hell forever if I divulged what would happen, what I would hear in the next 15 minutes. And of course, what he was about to share with me, since he would ask me if Dr. Runte would be acceptable as a member of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. What an amazing question, I thought. Was the name of the next president of Carleton. And it was when he sort of slid the CV across the table to me without mentioning any name. Maybe he thought the room was bugged, I don't know. I took a look at the name at the top of the page and instantly recognized it. It's a name that I first encountered back in the early 1980s when I was a young faculty member involved with one of the learned societies in Canada, and Dr. Runte was at that time president of the Canadian Federation for the Humanities, which she was from 1982 to 1984. So it's a name I had known since that time. Over the years, she has received many honors and awards, far too many for me to mention tonight. I will just mention two. Idiosyncratic choice, but two that seem to me to be important. She was president of the Canadian Committee for UNESCO from 1992 to 96, and is now an honorary life member of that commission. And perhaps most significantly, she was a recipient of the, inducted to the Order of Canada in 2002. Dr. Runte has had many lifetimes, it seems. Those of us who are getting to know her think that she never sleeps, and looking at her CV, I think you would agree. She's had many lifetimes of service, so it seems, to a great many academic societies, administrative groups, and even industry. So she serves, for example, on the board of the National Bank of Canada. She is a prolific author, 3 volumes of poetry, one of which has been translated into Romanian. Many edited books, including 3 volumes of Studies in 18th Century Culture, published by the University of Wisconsin Press. Many articles in academic journals. Seems to me very appropriate that someone who has written poems with titles such as Mon Pays and Nous Autres should be speaking to us this evening on the topic of the meaning of Canada, myth, irony, and compromise. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Roseann O'Reilly Runte.
Thank you very much, John. That was very kind of you, and I appreciate the warm welcome and lovely introduction. And I had another invitation for tonight. And it came from the Premier of the province, who was having dinner somewhere tonight, and he wrote, you know, the other university presidents are coming, you should come. And I wrote back to him, and I said to him, you know, if I wanted to be mean, I would tell you that if you gave us more money and we could at Carleton afford a really good lecturer, I could come to the dinner. But I said, I won't do that. I'll just send you a donation and ask you to please fund us better. I also would like to tell you that the pictures were taken on 4 or 5 trips that I made to the Arctic, and the music was Sibelius, and if any of you remember Glenn Gould's CBC broadcast, The Idea of the North, he chose Sibelius to play as the background, and that's why I chose Sibelius. I figured if Glenn Gould did, should be the right musical choice. So tonight I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the North, and the weather cooperated because we really needed a cool evening to set us up for this. Robertson Davies said that Canada is torn between a northern, rather extraordinary mystical spirit, which it fears, and the desire to present itself to the world as a Scotch banker. We fear the unknown, and perhaps we fear the North because knowing it will somehow alter its mysterious, elusive, faraway appeal and its nature, which forms our identity and our national myth. Today, I'd like to explore that myth and leave the Scottish banker aside, as financial occupations have little attraction in this economic context. Canada is indeed a northern nation, and when we're asked to describe the country, we inevitably cite geography and note the vicissitudes of the seasons. We enjoy the summer, but we are defined by the winter. Vocabulary, language, and culture are linked to nature and geography. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about this link between nature and abstract concepts and values, demonstrating the way that our way of describing good and evil, for example, is determined by our surroundings. He maintained that not only are words signs of natural facts, but these signs are metaphors illustrating the world of the spirit or the imagination. And Wallace Stevens later affirmed that, quote, "A mythology reflects its region. Each region of our globe is unique. Each language is also unique, with words having no equivalence. They cannot be translated into other tongues, and these special words are gems illustrating the richness and meaning of each language and culture. They provide the specific language in which the myth is expressed." When poet Douglas LePon wrote about the solitude of Canada, he entitled his verse, "A Country Without a Mythology." He was wrong. Canada's mythology is one of the land and with the land. When Northrop Frye posited that the early European settlers to Canada were turning their backs on nature, building houses huddled in circles against the vastness of the forests, or on the shore, looking back across the ocean to the land from whence the settlers came, he cited their fear. The settlers were not so much afraid of the weather, but of losing themselves and their religion, their values, and their culture in the midst of unending wilderness. They were like Hudson, who wrote about Patagonia in 1893, saying that he listened to the silence and that one day he had the bizarre idea of screaming aloud to observe the effect of this gesture on the countryside. He resisted because he considered this cry to be an act of uncertain violence, which would doubtless be contrary to civilized behavior. He said, "In that strange state of mind, I had become incapable of reflection. My brain was transformed from a thought machine to a machine whose purpose was unknown. To think was to start up that noisy mechanism in my head, and something ordered me to remain tranquil, and I was forced to obey." Hudson wrote shortly after this that he feared he was losing his sanity due to the silence and the solitude. Nonetheless, when he wrote, it was to describe the desolate geography. Nature is also a common theme in the earliest texts by both French and English settlers from the earliest days to the present. The cold and the isolation are far more than the setting of the novels like Anne Hébert's Kamouraska. From the outset, as the sled passes village after village, and how many of you have seen the movie Kamouraska? Okay, and you think back, and you remember her sitting in the sled, and they were just married, and they're heading north, and they just go village after village, and each village, they say the name of the village, every village along the way. Well, saying the name of the village, attempting to name them, is an attempt to own them, and that the attempt was impossible. The people, in the end, were owned by the wilderness, where civilization and civility battled man's savage nature, which was released by drink, taken initially as an antidote to the cold. The difficulty of life and of obtaining livelihood fill the pages of Canadian literature. From Margaret Atwood's Survival to Gil Adamson's The Outcast, nature is the cause and motivating factor, that which creates victims, heroes, and heroines. When Douglas Glover's heroine, Elle, in the eponymously named novel, assumes an independent identity, she was cast ashore on an inhospitable island in the St. Lawrence. When she takes on the qualities of the bear, which has been taught to dance, and ultimately wreaks revenge, she becomes myth personified. Nature is the basis of myth, the mythology of the North, the mythology of Canada. And let's take this discussion home to our very own fair city. Travel writer Jan Morris visited Ottawa once. She wrote an article called Ottawa, a half-imaginary metropolis. She observes from a safe distance the wonders of the Canadian wilderness. She writes, "Best of all, here and there around the capital, you may see as a white fuzz in the distant prospect, as a deafening marvel on the edge of some landscaped park, the fierce white waters, those thrilling hazards of Canada, which have haunted the national imagination always, which have meant so much in the history of this wanderer's country, and which remind the stranger still, even when tamed with sightseeing bridges, picnic sites, or explanatory plaques, that this is the capital of the great lone land. I think she was near Hogsback by Carleton. Despite the romantic enthusiasm of Jan Morris, the cold penetrates almost all texts. Take F.P. Grove, who wrote in The Turn of the Year, "Like a desert of barren snow is my mind, a white blank, stunned into unconsciousness of all things about me." And Northrop Frye's student and poet J. McPherson wrote, "All other winters shall break against hers, such fire is wedded to her frost." While we are indeed a northern nation, our settlement patterns distinctly deny this reality. The population of this nation is spread east to west in a narrow band across the southernmost part of the country. Canada is a nation defined by the northern parallels on which it lies, but which is actually conceived and organized on an east-west grid. The unifying factors are the Cross-Canada Highway, the Cross-Canada Railroad. Both are conceived to facilitate movement east to west and vice versa. It is no wonder that the provinces sometimes forget that they are each other's best trading partners and boast of north-south exchanges. But when we think of south, we think of south of the border. Snowbirds do not fly west. Cross-border shopping is practically a national sport, and some of our best hockey players are recruited to southern climes, virtually unknown for their outdoor rinks. The location of our cities and the fact that the majority of the population clings to the southernmost part of our northern nation creates a small context for irony and doubt. There is no doubt that a nation which defines itself as northern and prints tourist brochures featuring rosy-cheeked cherubs in toques, building ice sculptures, skating on canals, and eating beaver tails, exists in a state of constant irony when most of the people live south of the true north and spend spring in Florida, well, once in a while. The questions one might pose here are also imbued with irony. What would happen if global warming worsened? Would Canada suffer an identity crisis along with an environmental disaster? When shopping malls in Dubai contain ski hills, do we need nature to create an identity? We need only read Andrew Parkin's poem, Postcard to Happy Valley, to be reminded that wherever Canadians wander, the myth of our nature is within them. He expresses his nostalgia for the Orient in Canadian terms, writing, "One day this fallen maple leaf will flutter back to Happy Valley and turn a Hong Kong shade of red." Even our flag with its maple leaf reminds us of our connection to nature, however fragile in these days of global travel and acid rain. When we speak of the North, we tend to define it as vast and solid, white, empty, silent, pure, peaceful, and perhaps timeless and eternal, as we know that artifacts there do not disintegrate. The North is indeed vast, but the land and the ice are joined by water in an ever-moving configuration. Indeed, it has been pointed out by the Honorable Paul O'Callagh, Premier of Nunavut, that the concept of land separated by water is incorrect when applied to the North. One must see the water, not the land, as the unifying factor. When we think of the North as white, we are mistaken. I was never so surprised as when I caught my first glimpse of a majestic blue iceberg in a field of colored ice. Shades of green and blue mingled with browns and black specks. The earth is covered with boulders and stones of many hues on which grow lichen in the shades of red and yellow, green and gray. I think you saw some in the pictures. The north is a myriad of colors, and even its wintry night is colorful in its blackness, which envelops all and is itself the presence of all colors. The land is anything but white. The sound of ice cracking, the washing of semi-frozen water against the rocks, the gravel rolling in the wash of the waves, the moaning and whistling of the wind, the padding footsteps of the polar bear, the trotting gait of the caribou, the cry of the eider duck and the sound of snow sweeping under the wings of the Arctic swan, the dogs howling to the wolves who respond in kind, the runners of the sled squeaking on the snow, the sound of companions breathing, all form an incredible symphony, punctuated by the timpani of snowmobiles sputtering into action, the sound of my own heart beating, and the quarter-time crunch of the tundra beneath my feet. Silence does not exist. Once a human being is there to listen, there is noise even if the trees, among the oldest on earth, only as tall as a dandelion without a flower, and would not make much noise falling, do fall. The land has been tattooed with roads and scarred by people who have disfigured it between two seasons of ice. You can tell the population of a town by the size of a mountain of human waste which is piled frozen or semi-frozen each week just off the main road. Since there is no plumbing, a truck, which is called the honey truck, collects waste and simply adds it to the pile. Broken snowmobiles litter the landscape. Bones from picnics by humans or wolves litter the meadows. Nothing disintegrates, and every time the surface of the land is scratched, the mark remains. A caribou footprint near my tent had been there for 10 years. The spinal column bones from a whale, and that was a picture too, my guide Ernie picked up and used to teach me a native game, were very old indeed. He had been playing with the bones from that same carcass since he was an infant, as had his father before him and his grandfather before that. Every time they pass that way. While the bones might last forever, so does the damage done to the land, which is only a few inches of topsoil over rock or ice. The north is like an equation in which one makes a mistake. You can erase the equation, but not the mistake. This is a terrible burden we all bear, as the north is our shared responsibility, just as it is our shared pride and source of meaning. The north is also, contrary to the Arcadian dream of a land of peace and honey, a land of violence. The raging tempests and harsh conditions make survival difficult for people and animals. Smaller mammals fall prey to the larger. Smaller fish are devoured by larger fish and mammals. Those beautiful sled dogs fight for dominance. And while they may sleep with sledders on the road, they attack people in the towns. Each day you may witness polar bears dining on seals, and seals fishing for their repast while human hunters slay both. This is hardly an image of peaceful coexistence. Thus, the attributes of our northern myth are not based on reality. The divergence between belief and fact becomes a matter of serious concern when we consider Charles Taylor's reflection in his latest book, A Secular Age. If we live on a continent which has largely separated church and state, and in a time when religion for many has become weakened and perhaps even bereft of meaning, then we need some shared institutions and ideals in which to believe. The fervor of sports fans who have made almost a religion of the World Series, attending events regularly, cheering their favorite national team with great vigor, is perhaps an illustration of one way in which some people replace religious practice in their lives today. A national identity is another way in which we fill the void. We wave the flag and our hearts fill with pride when our soldiers return from keeping the peace, when our scholars win the Nobel Prize, when our scientists create robotic arms for space missions, when our writers gain international recognition, and our athletes receive laurels at the Olympic Games. We sing together of our land, and our land is indeed our geography of hope. This land is the land of our dreams and aspirations, and simultaneously the land of our memory. Margaret Atwood's poem about Susanna Moodie, whose son drowned, ends with the line, "I planted him in this country like a flag. We are at once slain by the wild and a part of the wilderness." In his article, Haunted by a Lack of Ghosts, the title of which came from a poem by Earl Burney, Northrop Frye speculated that the need for the garrison and the consequent garrison mentality is not based on acquisitiveness, not the Rousseauian staking out of territory, but by the building of fences, but rather a desire to capture the land in response to the question, where is here? Frye extended the speculation to place this question in opposition to the existential query, who am I? My response is, our identity is the land. As F.R. Scott writes in his poem, Trans-Canada, this frontier too is ours. This everywhere whose life can only be led at the pace of a rocket is common to man and man, probably meant man and woman or woman and woman, and every country below is an I land. We are defined by our landscape, even our imagined landscape. Does it matter if our idea of the landscape is different from reality? Does it affect our national myth or identity? This is the question Taylor frames in a different fashion in his work on cultural authenticity. Taylor defines authenticity as a moral ideal, not as a rhetoric of self-fulfillment, as does Alan Bloom. Taylor's philosophy is reminiscent of that of Malraux or Camus' anti-heroes who opt for humanism, for positive action in a world of decline and negative signs. Yet Taylor's focus in Gage is ever the individual. On the other hand, being true to oneself is only a precursor to one's relationship to others, and thus the origin of authenticity centers not solely on the individual, but on how the individual relates to others. In this respect, I believe that John Ralston Saul's latest ingenious book, A Fair Country, Telling Truths About Canada, is centered too entirely on the single influence of the northern population. I believe that Canada has been formed by an incredible mixture of populations, old and new. However, what makes this mixture different from that of other nations on this continent is our geography. Just as our authenticity is defined by others, so too is our identity defined by the land in which we live and from which we take inspiration. However, if our image of the land differs virulently from reality, are we left without meaning? When I was in Baffin Island, I visited with an Inuit sculptor. He showed me his collection of perfectly elegant, perfectly Shakespearean swans, sculpted just like the ones Ottawa has or had or maybe still has, sculpted in white marble imported from Italy. This sculptor had never seen southern swans. He imagined their image, inspired by the story by Hans Christian Andersen. He gave his swans the bodies of eider ducks, and he suspended on them longer, fancifully arched necks. He sold them to tourists thanks to the encouragement of the head of the Hudson's Bay Depot. They were very popular. Before swans, he sculpted bears and fish, also at the suggestion of the manager of the Hudson's Bay store. He asked me which sculpture I liked best. There was one wonderful piece in the corner, both abstract and real at once. I singled it out, but he told me it was not for sale. It was his sculpture of the wind dancing. He had never seen the wind, but his imagination had created the most beautiful work of art. Is it possible that our myth could be better if actually not based on reality? If we are a northern nation and know fundamentally that our interpretation of the North is not correct, are we not simply then more creative? Montesquieu wrote that nations need a founding myth to survive. Even the troglodytes in the Persian letters depended on a founding myth to continue their existence. When their reality no longer respected the myth, their utopian state foundered. The problem of Canada is not that we do not respect the myth, But our myth is not founded on reality. The nation is not in danger of disintegration. Rather, living with dissonance, the clash between culture and nature on a daily basis, we have become not only creative, but masters of compromise. The nation's character, cited by so many in works like those of our fine colleague Andrew Cohen in his delightful book, The Unfinished Canadian, and the authors with whom we debate, such as Michael Adams in Fire and Ice, The United States, Canada, and the Myth of Converging Value, are notable. Cohen finds affirmation not in polls or treaties, but in our poetry, our art, our songs, the expressions of ourselves and our profound beliefs. And are these not stories, and are these not myths? The Franklin expedition has recently received attention as Canada's interest in the North has gained prominence because of discussions of national sovereignty. For many years, it was believed that Franklin's crew met a cruel fate at the hands of nature. They supposedly gave up their lives in the quest to survive in Arctic conditions. More recently, in works by authors including Margaret Atwood, Pierre Burton, and Rudy Wiebe, it has been noted that the sailors lost their lives not at the hands of nature, but of civilization. The lead in the canned foods they brought with them was the true cause of their demise. Thus we discover yet another irony in our understanding of the North. In this case, the myth of the North is enhanced. As we search for the skeleton of the lost ship, which doubtless remains buried in ice preserved by the cold, we juxtapose yet again myth and reality. In solving a mystery, we bring together the elements of human courage and cupidity, vanity and vainglory, thereby forcing ourselves to retell the story, recasting perhaps the players in roles varying from victim to villain. The introduction of the element, lead, reminds us of the consistent leitmotif of pollution and the fact that the receding ice packs risk not only defining our coastline, but our identity. Students at Carleton University, along with Professor Fraser Taylor, are creating living maps of the region, combining folklore and scientific knowledge, cartography, and culture. They are creating living digital documents. Well, let's think about Wallace Stevens' verse when he talks about a country without a landscape, without a natural horizon. He says that such a nation cannot have a myth because myths are born in and of nature. We can rewrite myths. Johnny Appleseed could become Susie Appleseed. But if we eliminate the apple tree, does the story have any meaning? We shall always have a landscape. It is undeniably changing. We also have a choice. We can, like the pioneer poets described by Northrop Frye, be swallowed up by nature and the flood of problems we've brought to the North, or we can, like our students sharing with the inhabitants of the North, assume responsibility for the environment. Together we can own the North and thereby gain the opportunity to rewrite the myth of the North for the next generation. We can distinguish ourselves from other nations in the world and tell our story. Our ownership of the North is a need much more profound than national sovereignty, defense, or international privilege. It is at the core of our identity and meaning. Nothing will change the fact that we occupy, albeit and fortunately sparsely, a large swath of territory which surrounds the pole. Our circumpolar circumstance, described so well by Tom Simons in his admirable work on the North, combined with the fact that the land resembles ever less the idea of it we treasure, means that we must be more creative and effect more compromise. The question is whether we compromise the land and those who live there today, along with the values of equity, sustainability, and responsibility, or our economic aspirations and reality. If we select the second option, we will offer ourselves the gift of hope, hope for nature, culture, and the future, and we will thereby save our myth and the myth makers, for the myth written over Canada's history is one which, as a people, we've always tried to improve an imperfect world. We believe we are the custodians both of our dreams and our actions. Can we be peacekeepers on the international stage if we cannot live in harmony with nature in our own borders. The environment is the global language which not only offers us regional identities, but an international unity of purpose and understanding. Time and the seasons mark everyone's passage through life. Winds and tides know no boundaries, and we all share the brevity of our existence. Nature is the element which unites people around the planet. If we are at peace at home in and with our northern land, we can indeed be the nation and the people we aspire to become. I would like to conclude on a note of positive hope. Myths are usually based on a memory of the past which cannot be recovered. Canada's myth is not one of the past, nor is it lost in tales of our predecessors. It is not real, but it has roots in a vision of reality. Our myth is one of discovery. We have never owned the narrative, rather our myth and the North own us. The Blackfoot name for the western park called Writing on Stone Park is Ainskip, which means is being written. The rocks in this park contain glyphs whose meaning is pondered even today by each passerby. In local color, Mark ably describes them as oracles where a wanderer might glimpse, like a dream passing across the face of stone, the pattern written for his life. I would posit that we are also etching our future in the boulders of time as we alter our land and write our own future. Our continual discovery of our North, and thereby of ourselves, can indeed continue to make us strong and free. Thank you.
Dr. Runte has very kindly agreed to take questions, and I think we have microphones set up on either side of the room. I would invite you to come to a microphone if you have a question, and perhaps I could get things started myself, if you will permit. I know that for many outside of Canada, when they think of the identity of Canadians, they think about language. So do you have thoughts about the role of language in our myths in Canada?
Well, certainly. What I was trying to say a little bit about language, and this would be both English and French, or any language that one speaks, Dene, or whatever it is, all languages have a regional and a geographic origin and significance. If you think about it, people who live in the desert probably don't have the word for goldfish. In the book Smilla's Sense of Snow, they had something like 23 names of snow. They're describing all the different states of snow, the grainy snow, the slushy snow, the crunchy snow. The vocabulary that we have is tied to our land. But just as our vocabulary is tied to the land, so is our culture. Think about it. In people like Aboriginal people who move from place to place, their values are going to be that motion is good, that instability is good. People who like to be in one place, who live on a mountain, are going to believe that living in one place is good, stability is good, and mountain living is good. Our own vision of where we are affects both our language and our culture and our cultural beliefs. And I think that works in all languages. Oh, okay. Oh, he's just standing there with a mic in his hand, and he really didn't have a question, and and he was standing there afraid he'd get called on. Yeah, if you raise your hand, you got a question. If you scratch your head, you get.
Hi. Canadian culture in a contemporary context includes echoes of European culture, African culture. cultures from all over the world. Do you believe that Canadian myths have echoes of global landscapes as well as local landscapes?
Absolutely. And those are transmitted in our languages. We just, in my class, read Nalo Hopkinson's novel about Toronto, which is written using the language of Caribbean immigrants to Canada. And yes, indeed, that language colors the myth, and the heritage of the people color the myth. And where I thought that there was a little bit of a disagreement that I would have with John Ralston Saul is that in his latest book, he says that what makes Canada so special is that when the Westerners came to Canada, they met the local inhabitants who had a very special culture and civilization. And it was the encounter of the West with that civilization that created the Canada that we know today, including the healthcare system. And I thought perhaps it was a little more complex than that, and it was all the peoples that came to Canada encountering each other, as well as the original inhabitants that created the Canada that is, and is indeed the myth that we have of the country.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, somebody almost in the front row. Oh, and there's somebody there.
So thank you very much. Very enjoyable lecture. It occurred to me as you were speaking that one of the important aspects, at least, of the connection to the land, the connection to nature that we spin our myths in terms of, is that there's a very important sense in which being confronted with the land that we are in brings us face to face with our vulnerability as human beings. Mm-hmm. And so if we draw that connection, do you think it would be fair to make the further connection that to the extent that our myths are very important for meaning and for giving us a sense of self-worth and dignity, that it at least inspires us to think about the extent to which we should think of our own dignity as Canadians in terms of vulnerability?
Absolutely. I think that's a lovely thought. I agree. I think that's a nice thought. Yeah. There's.
Hello? Yeah. Hello? Do you think we're perhaps in danger of losing our culture and losing our myths as we become more and more urbanized? So many people now, a surprisingly large fraction of the population, may never have seen the night sky. To them, snow is a mixture of sand and salt. Mm-hmm. The northern lights we don't see anymore. Are we losing our myths? Are we losing our culture?
Well, that's what Wallace Stevenson says in a poem called "The Land Without a Mythology." He's writing about Connecticut, and he says that when you cover up the landscape with cement and you build a bunch of buildings on top of it, and you flatten the hills and you change the landscape, that you have hidden nature, and without being able to see nature, you can have no myth, and therefore people are separated from a myth and have no meaning. I thought about that when I was trying to write this, and I thought, you know, we do then create urban myths, and there are always new legends and thoughts that we create. But the North is an interesting thought and myth because the majority of people in Canada haven't been to the North. Most people haven't been to Eclipse Sound and Baffin Island. Most people haven't walked across where the North Pole is. And yet we all, if you ask people, where are you from, you say the North. And I was in Japan giving a lecture in Japan, and somebody said to me, why is it that Americans are bellicose and Canadians are peacekeepers? And I stood there and I said, well, you know, maybe it's the weather. It's just so cold. And you know, when I thought of that, I thought, well, you know, here I am immediately, it is not that cold in the city. It's not that cold in our offices. It's not that cold in our buildings. But I believe in this myth of the North. And if you go south to United States and you go to Florida, and one of the joys of going to Florida, the fringe benefit of your holiday is to turn on the TV and find out it's really nasty, home. It's like it adds a little value to your vacation. That's like the value added. Well, when you turn it on and it says there's a big snowstorm, they always say it's coming from Canada. It might be coming across the Rockies, but it's always that Canadian cold that's sweeping across the U.S. I mean, they even believe that we're cold. So there is this myth, whether you're in the city or not, that there is a North and that it is cold. Well, I agree that it's still cold. I also agree that I sat in a lecture on global warming one cold winter's day in Toronto, and at the end of the lecture, somebody raised their hand and said, well, in 10 years, how much warmer will it be here? And the man said 0.5 degree, and I thought, well, that's good. But that wasn't really very nice because it raised the sea level too. But we all, whether we've been to the North or not, we think about it. We think about it being white. We think about it being massive and pure and quiet and peaceful, and it's none of those things. So our myth is not really based on reality. That doesn't stop us from having a myth. But what happens when that comes really smack in our face? We don't have to go there now. We just have that myth. But what happens when we have to recognize that it's no longer true? Then do we just make up another myth? Do we create an urban myth that it's Canada at that point? And then what is the country? I guess it's up to us to decide whether we want to create a new myth or keep this one going. Oh, somebody else, I guess, has the mic.
What I found very interesting in your lecture is how you're constructing a certain image of Canada and perhaps also circulating certain myths about Canada. And I think one of the myths is that Canada is a nation of compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And if this is a myth, do you think it's based on reality?
What do you think? I think that we have always in this country chosen, most of the time, chosen compromise rather than conflict. So I do think it's a characteristic of the nation.
Our myth of the North is being undermined by global warming in that our sovereignty is being challenged. But I'm wondering, our other myth is the myth of what we are not, and we are not Americans. That's part of our mythology. We're not the American culture. Mm-hmm. But now the American culture, so to speak, is thawing under a new leader. So perhaps that mythology is now being undermined as well. I was wondering what you would think of that.
Well, we do have a few myths. And, you know, when people visit a country, they see little parts of it, and then they will describe that as the country. You know the story of the people that describe the elephant. Some people think it's the tail, some people think it's the tusks. Well, if people go to Halifax, they're going to describe one thing. If they go to Calgary, they're going to describe something else. So it's very hard to describe a country, and the same thing about the United States. It's there are many different peoples that make up a country, and so I agree. I am speaking in generalities a little bit, a lot tonight.
Hi. I'd actually like to follow up on your comment about speaking in generalities just now. You talked about the different languages to describe nature and culture across the country. Do you think people all across Canada think of the North in the same way? Like on either coast, would it be the same as here?
Obviously, not everybody thinks the same way. Probably you and I don't think the same way, and we might be from the same place. So there are always variations and differences. And while I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the Inuit who live in the North and how they talk about the North, because it is their home. They don't have the same mythology that we do, and you know, they see the North more as reality. They see what I described as their everyday life, and yet when they talk about the land, it's as if the land L had a capital L, and it is very special, and it has a meaning in their life which is far beyond the current reality.
Okay, thanks.
There's one person in the white sweater.
I just try to articulate this. It's a large class, a large lecture. I'm just wondering what you think in terms of relating nature and I was personally raised on a farm, so on 200 acres in southern Ontario. And David Suzuki, obviously everyone knows him, says in terms of environmental sustainability, we're at the edge of a cliff. Many politicians argue against that. And then if you look to the economic times that are present, would you give me your feedback on how you think nature, language, and that the actual economy is all interlinked, and that between the US and Canada, that we should maybe adopt a Swedish, Scandinavian type reality versus the way in which you described how we're surrounded by concrete. And I mean, if we evolve further, would you suggest that maybe we should shift our evolution and look to other countries instead of US and Canada and adapt that?
Okay, that was a question that I'm having a little trouble getting my arms around, but let me say that Tom Simons, in his work on Canada, published the first map of Canada seen from the North Pole. And when you look at it, you see Canada not as part of North America, but as part of a group of nations ringing the pole. And by doing that, he actually gives us a different context and other nations with which to collaborate and to share. So yes, we should look at other nations, particularly the other nations that surround the pole. Question of the economy and the environment, probably I would say, why don't we look at von Weizsäcker's books. He wrote a whole series of books. One of them is called Factor 4. He's a professor now at the University of California in Santa Barbara, but he was the head of the Wuppertal Climate Institute in Europe. And in that book, he explains how companies can reduce their emissions by 75%, but at the same time increase their productivity by 25%, and so they increase their the money that they make. So it is possible, even in difficult economic times, to improve our environmental status, or whatever, our commitment to the environment.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got one over here. Somebody's got the microphone in his hand. Well, we can't stop that.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I'm just curious about your thoughts of examples or instances when myths of the North are kind of marshaled by either Canadian politicians or sometimes Canadian corporations, sometimes both, and how that fits into your instance of irony. And I'm thinking actually of two good examples. There's the case in the 1960s with the creation of Telesat, this company that was, a joint private-public venture, and the main myth that sold it is this idea of the North. And then there's also an interesting instance on the back of the $100 bill. You have this image of RadarSat, another satellite that's joint with a Merriam-Waddington poem or a quote from it that has some kind of weird connection to Jacques Cartier and this, this somehow connotation that this new satellite is, a new Jacques Cartier, and what it hides, this idea that RadarSat is also around to kind of map the North, to mine the North, and to, anyway, so yeah, just the way that it becomes politicized, the myth.
Okay. Haven't seen a $100 bill. But obviously these things are politicized, and I quoted the premier of Nunavut, who speaks passionately about the environment, but in some of his public speeches, he's also requested that large ports be built in the Arctic because he thinks that would bring economic development to the region. And there might be a little bit of a contradiction between building more ports and preserving the landscape. So there are many contradictions and many ironies, and you picked out two others. So, and I'll go check out a $100 bill when I get paid. Yes, ma'am.
I just had a question. If you perceive in the South these functional myths of the North, I wonder if the kind of inverse happens as well. And if you could say something about people who are established in the North having a myth of the South, if you perceive of that at all.
Well, they probably have some really strange ideas about us. You might have seen one of the pictures. There was somebody, you probably didn't even know it was me. I had so many clothes on I could hardly move. I took that picture to prove that I was there because somebody said to me, how could you talk about the North when you've never been there? But I wanted you to know I really was there. When I went north, I went with one time that I was there a number of times, but one of the times that I was there, I went camping on the ice with a group of Inuit. They were hunting caribou, and they were fishing, and they were looking for narwhals, and the narwhals got stuck in the ice, and we didn't ever see any narwhals. But while they were hunting and so on, I was taking pictures and writing and talking to them and trying to learn a little bit about their way of life and their way of thinking. I had this. It was so cold. We were out all day in the elements, and and it was 24 hours a day light because it was in the summertime, and when they would have been out 6 hours or something, they would get really tired, and so all of a sudden they'd say, "We rest," and they would just go plop and lie down on the ice on their backs with their little hoods pulled a little bit over their face, but their face was still exposed, their arms across their chest. They kind of looked like they were dead, and they would just lie there and go to sleep, sound asleep for like an hour, and then they would get up and carry on. I was so cold I couldn't sit down. So while they were sleeping, I was jumping around. And I didn't want to go too far away from them because I'd get lost, because I realized that I'm really good at telling my directions and finding things in the woods, but you find it by a tree, and there's like a tree with moss on it or a specific rock, and all of a sudden, even though there is color and everything, it's all and there are moments when it's all a whiteout. I could have been walking in circles and I would never have known. They were able to go miles, and all of a sudden put their stick in, and there'd be under the ice they would have buried gas for their boat, and they would know it from season to season. So they really thought that I was really funny. I couldn't sit down. I jumped around all the time. I tried to sleep at regular hours when you don't do that when it's like 24 hours a day. And they actually laughed at me, and I realized that they must have other people from the South come up and visit them, and they probably do think that we're really pretty funny and pretty silly. They pulled the fish out of when we were fishing, and the water was almost like, Jell-O just before it's hard. And so the fish is swimming in this water, because it's not thin enough for the fish to swim quickly. So the fish is sort of swimming slowly through this water. And it's so clear, you can see miles down there. There's this fish. And they don't even bother with bait on the line. You just hang the hook down there and hold it. And you actually see the fish go, oh. And then it starts swimming towards the hook. And you just hold it still there and, wait an eternity. Oh, I'm jerking. But, and the fish goes and eats the hook, and then they pull it out of the water. And before it actually hits the boat, it's semi-frozen. And they cut into it and slice off a piece and hand it to you and say, eat it, it's good. And I was thinking to myself, well, it's kind of like sushi, right? But, it was hard. They really did think I was a little funny because, I didn't have the same customs. Okay, so we all see each other in different ways, and we have to remember that, and we have to remember that what each person believes is important, and their beliefs and our beliefs, when they come together, help us discover new and good things. I really believe that the whole world has been discovered. People have walked all over this globe. There's not a whole lot left to discover except what's in our minds. And what stops us from discovering new things are our prejudices, our preconceived notions. And the way we can get rid of them is by interacting with other people and by sharing ideas and by realizing that we look pretty silly to them. And they probably, when I went home, told stories for weeks about this funny lady from the South. So knowing that knocks down another level of prejudice and helps me understand who I am. And each of us grows that way. So thank you very much for trying to grow with me tonight. Thanks.
Roseann, I think I would speak for all in the room tonight when I say how pleased and proud we are to have a president who writes poetry, who reads very widely, both fiction and nonfiction, but more importantly, who has demonstrated tonight that you engage with the ideas expressed in the books that you read. So welcome to Carleton, but most importantly, welcome to the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and thank you for your talk tonight.